I'm Alex, and these are the books that I read in 2022. In January, I read one book, A Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt. Give it 4 out of 5. Take responsibility, challenge yourself, find balance in your life, then you'll find happiness. And I would recommend this book. In February, I read 2 books. The first is The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. Similar to Happiness Hypothesis, take responsibility in your life, put yourself in uncomfortable situations, and you become stronger as a person. I also would recommend this book. Napoleon the Great by Andrew Roberts. 5 out of 5. Great book, great man, great story. If you want lessons on leadership, lessons on mistakes that you shouldn't make, then this is a great book to go about that. And I would recommend this book. On to March, I read 15 books in March, picking things up. First is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. 5 out of 5. Great book, in line with the Napoleonic Wars, so continued the theme of Napoleon the Great. Just phenomenally well written. Incredible story. Didn't get too much for the historical input from Tolstoy. Thought it was slightly misguided, but the writing and the story are fantastic. Very easy to read. Not as daunting as it seems once you actually get into the book. Very short chapters, manageable, easy to read. Would 100% recommend this book. Christ Stop the Eboli by Carlo Levi. 3.5 out of 5. It's alright. It's an okay book. Good insight into the world of the South, a bit of fascist Italy. Fairly interesting book, quite niche. I wouldn't recommend this book. Written Against Napoleon by Roger Knight. 4 out of 5. Interesting book, but I am very interested in this period of history, focusing more on the economic side and the logistical side of the Napoleonic Wars. Good book, I liked it, but not for everyone. I'm not going to recommend this book. The Dangerous Book for Boys by Conn and Hal Iggulden. Bit of a throwback, nostalgic read to go back to something I read as a child. Yeah, I liked it. I wouldn't recommend it for adults. I think for a child, 5 out of 5, great book. You know, practical projects, lots of interesting information, mainly centered around the UK. But yeah, very good book for any children out there, but maybe not one that I recommend to adults. Zorba the Greek by Nikos Kazantzakis. Overhyped for me. I think I'd give it 3 out of 5. 3.5 out of 5. Okay, 3.5 out of 5. Again, it's about finding balance in life. You know, how much structure, how much order, how much chaos do you want in your life. Just not for me. I didn't really engage with the character of Zorba. Writing is fine, but yeah, not one of my favourite books, not one of the best books I've read. 3.5 out of 5, and I would not recommend this book. Journey Under the Midnight Sun by Keigo Higashino. 5 out of 5. What a great book. Page turner, could not stop reading. Maybe not the greatest payoff, but it's a phenomenal book. And if you haven't read Japanese literature before, this is a great place to start. Or, well, there are lots of other great starting points, but this is a book I would really recommend and really enjoyed reading. A Christmas Carol and Other Writings by Charles Dickens. Classic story. Christmas Carol. 5 out of 5. Very good, very engaging, short story, thoroughly enjoyed. The other Christmas writings, 2 out of 5. I understand why they didn't get published and don't have as much press as A Christmas Carol. They are mediocre. Charles Dickens' style of writing, perhaps a style of writing of the age, which is very long sentences and very drawn out, works when you've got a compelling story and a good story like A Christmas Carol. When there's not much substance to the plot, it can be a very difficult read. And I would not recommend buying this volume, although it is a very attractive volume. But I would rather recommend just buying a volume with A Christmas Carol or another collection of Charles Dickens short stories. 1812, Napoleon's Fatal March on Moscow by Adam Zamoyski. 5 out of 5, great book. Again, time period I really enjoy, but this is probably one of the most brutal periods of history or periods of the Napoleonic War. gives a perspective on our current lives and what was expected of us compared to what was expected of people of that era during those wars. Really, really difficult time. Brutal sort of experience. You know, walking from France to Moscow and then having to walk back again in some of the most horrendous conditions, being hunted down by not only the Russian military, but also peasants living in the land and the guerrilla force. I would recommend this book if you are at all interested in history, at all in this era, but if not, maybe give it a miss. It is quite a long volume. 6 Tragedies by Seneca. 3 out of 5. It's fine. It's not great. The most interesting part of it is just the contextual, to see the culture at the time and the stories that were compelling to those who were contemporary to Seneca. Otherwise, I don't think it's his best writing. I don't think they're the most interesting plays that I've ever read. And I don't think that I would recommend this book. Le Petit Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. 5 out of 5. Great book. One that I reread all the time. And one of the main books that I use to help learn French. It is a beautiful story. I learn something new every time that I read it. And it's one that I will keep coming back to throughout my life, I'm sure. It teaches you how to value the little things, find out what's really important in your life, and how to make sure that you stay focused on that and pursue it to the end. 100% recommend this book. Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling. Another childhood book that I decided to return to this month. I give it 4 out of 5 for what it is. Bearing in mind that it's a children's book, taking that into account, I think there is some enjoyment to be read as an adult. I don't know whether that was just down to nostalgia, but still a very good book, a classic. And I think, yeah, if you haven't read it, give it a read, but just bear in mind it's a children's book and have that in mind when you're reading it, and, you know, temper your expectations. Russia Against Napoleon by Dominic Lieven. Similar to 1812. Didn't enjoy it as much, give it a 4 out of 5. Still think it's a very good book. Gives more context of the time and the whole sort of Napoleonic Wars from the Russian perspective. Very enjoyable. Again, bearing in mind I'm interested in the era, and I would not recommend this to people who aren't. But if you are, great. Written 1714 to 1851 by Denis Richards and Anthony Quick. This is written as a school textbook from sort of, 50, 60 years ago. I'd give it a 4 out of 5. Bearing that in mind, I think it gives a good overview of the time period and it's interesting in that respect, but I wouldn't recommend it to a modern reader. I think there are better books, don't think it's worth it. Antigone by Jean Anouilh. I would give it 4 out of 5. Good story, well told. I think its strength is in the middle section, but still a good story nevertheless. And I would recommend this book if you are interested in reading historical plays, or just plays in general, because I know they're not for everyone. Otherwise, yeah, would not recommend it. Last one for March is Point Counterpoint by Aldous Huxley. Different from the normal Huxley story you'd expect, quite light on the science fiction. Good book nevertheless, more looking at the social side of England at the time. Good pacing to the book. It may seem that it starts off slow, but it really builds, and I think came to a very, if not satisfying conclusion, a very remarkable conclusion. One that will leave an impact, and one that will leave you sort of thinking about it once you finish reading the book. Would recommend this. In April, I read 13 books, starting with Plato's Republic. I'll give it 3 stars. I know it's a classic. I know it's meant to be an incredible book. I did not enjoy it that much. It was one of the later books by Plato I have read, and maybe that biased me against him because I did not enjoy his Socratic writings. I find them very laboured, very pedantic, and not the philosophy that I really have enjoyed. I think they're interesting books in the historical respect. Again, the idea of the time period, the ideas that were prevalent at that time. Interesting in that regard. But as modern political thought and as philosophical thought in general, Plato is not my favourite. I wouldn't recommend The Republic, and I think there are philosophers and thinkers from that time period who are much more interesting and engaging than Plato. The Fratricides by Nikos Kazantzakis, second book by him, and going to give this one 5 out of 5. It's a phenomenal book. Really touching story. The ending is devastating, I found. Speaks a lot about society, conflict in society, resolving that conflict, and the impossibility of that task. And then also just the interrelationships between people, the relationship to the church at that time in Greece during the Civil War. It's a phenomenal book. Much preferred to Zorba the Greek, even though Zorba the Greek is much more popular or well known. But I think The Fratricides is one of the best works by Nikos Kazantzakis, and I would 100% recommend it to anyone. The next two books are The History of Alexander by Quintus Curtius Rufus and Alexander the Great by Arrian. I put them together because, again, the same rating, 4 stars. They're both written as contemporaries to Alexander, or, within a century of him living, which makes them very interesting. And I think the two texts which fulfill that criteria of being contemporary to Alexander and historical accounts of what he went through that survived to the modern day. They are difficult to discern which is myth and which is reality. Some of the stories and accounts of Alexander's deeds are very hard to believe, but I'm sure there is some truth within them in terms of his leadership. And similarly to the biography of Napoleon, they are a great handbook of leadership. And not only how to lead those who have chosen to be led by you, but how to win over people who, well, in this case, have conquered, but how to win over people who aren't so willing to follow you. And for that reason, I think they are very good books, but I would not necessarily recommend them to people purely based on the time period that they were written in. I think they're more up-to-date books that are easier to read. The book in question that is easy to read is Alexander the Great by Robin Lane Fox. This primarily uses the two accounts by Arrian and Quintus Curtius Rufus as the main background to the biography of Alexander the Great, as a lot of the contemporary biographies do, also drawing upon other sources. Again, if you want to learn about leadership, about the period from a very mythological figure, I think it is a very good read, and this is in my eyes, the definitive biography of Alexander the Great. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend this book. Next is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Another great book. I mean, Tolstoy is a wonderful writer. Equally as accessible as War and Peace. I think perhaps more so, and out of the two, I would say that I prefer Anna Karenina. I think it is the better book. It's a 5 out of 5, just like War and Peace. It's, really fundamentally about how to find happiness in life, how to understand your desires, whether they're fleeting or whether they're more long-term. It's about love, it's about death, and it's about how to live a good life. And I would 100% recommend it to anyone. It's not as daunting as you think. Tolstoy is much more accessible, very short chapters, very easy to read. Might take a while, but it will not be a slog. And I think it is, a book that everyone should read. And Tolstoy is an author that everyone should read. Next is Human Universe by Brian Cox. 5 out of 5, very good book. Not on perhaps the most popular topic, but I think one that is very interesting to understand our place within the world. Gives insights into meaning, how to pursue truth and scientific thought, and is a very good book in that regard. If you're interested in science at all, in physics, I would recommend Human Universe by Brian Cox. Next is A History of Religious Ideas, Volume 1 by Mircea Eliade. Another niche book, gave 4 out of 5. I think it is interesting. It gives an insight into the archaic religions and how religious thought really emerged, mainly looking at what we would now consider mythology. It gives a lot of insight into how to live well, the idea of sacrifice, thoughts about death, and how humans historically dealt with finding meaning and purpose in the world, and how they would attribute certain characteristics to different deities and different phenomena that we would now understand better, but at the time seemed to come from the heavens. I think it's very interesting in that regard from a historical standpoint, but I do not think that I would recommend this book to everyone, purely because it's quite a niche topic. Atomic Habits by James Clear, 3 out of 5, overhyped. I mean, essentially it's the small steps and small things that you do on a day-to-day basis will amount to greater changes. And that's the only way to go about it. There's no overnight success. It's got to be the day-to-day. It's got to be the small changes and the systems that you put in place. The habits, essentially. It doesn't need to be a book. It's not that deep a concept. I understand why it gains so much traction. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of self-help books. I think they're better suited to a 2-minute video or a very short blog post. There's normally just a lot of filler, and well, I've given you the summary. You don't need to read it, and I wouldn't recommend this book or self-help in general, apart from a few. The Iliad by Homer. I don't think I can rate the book, purely because I read it blind, and it's not an easy book to read. There's a lot of knowledge that you need, particularly depending on the volume, since this book did not use the names from Greek mythology, but rather use the name of the Roman gods, which I'm less familiar with. So the story in that regard was quite difficult to follow. I think epic poems in general can be hard narratives to follow purely from the writing style. It is an interesting book on leadership and the mythology of that time. To read about this epic story, this epic battle, or this epic conflict, rather. If you do have a good understanding of Greek mythology and ancient Greece, I think it would be an interesting book. I don't think it's a book that everyone needs to read, but I think it is an interesting book in regards to historical context, once again, which seems to be a trend for most of the books on this list. Kilometer Zero by Maud and Kua. 2.5 out of 5. Just not a good book, or just not an okay book. It's fine. It's a bit of sort of pop fiction, very self-helpy, but in a very in-your-face sort of way. In fairness, I didn't read it for the story. I just read it to practice French with. I don't know if there's an English version of this book. It's not the most complex story. It's very readable. The story flows fine. But it's just a bit of throwaway fiction. It's not a book you're gonna come back to, for the story at least. And I would not recommend this book. There are much better ways to spend your time. The Complete Poems by Catullus. 4 out of 5 stars. Very funny, very interesting, and I think it's a good book to go into blind, or good selection of poetry to go into blind. There are a handful of real gems in there, and if you're interested in poetry, interested in ancient Rome, I would definitely recommend you to pick it up. It is very surprising. Pursuit of Italy by David Gilmour. 5 out of 5. Really good overview of Italy. Quite funny reading. It's not the most glorious history, aside from ancient Rome, which obviously is, peak of world power. But the rest of it is an amusing read for sure. Looking at Italy try and get its act together and its numerous attempts to return to being a world power. If you're interested in Italy, I think this is a great place to start, and I would recommend this book on that basis. But if you're not, then not essential reading. In May, I read 17 books, starting with Ernest Hemingway's short stories. For me, it was a 5 out of 5, but I'm a big fan of Ernest Hemingway's blunt style, his very basic form of prose. If you are not a fan of Ernest Hemingway's style, then this is not going to be the book that changes your mind. but if you do, then I would recommend it. Some very good stories with some very powerful lines. Again, it's on the same lines of how to live well, dealing with death, dealing with obstacles in life, and it's semi-biographical to an extent, and I would recommend it to any Hemingway fans. Small Giants by Bo Burlingham, which is a book on how to succeed as a small business owner. I would give it 3 out of 5. It's fine. The case studies are interesting. As a marketing book, I don't know how helpful it is, since the case studies were fairly unique in character, but there are still some things that can be gleaned from them. But I would not recommend this book. The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing by Al Ries and Jack Trout. 2 out of 5, maybe 1 out of 5. They're called Immutable Laws of Marketing, but the first two contradict each other, so I'm not sure how they can coexist. Would not recommend this book. Rhinoceroses by Ionesco. I would give it a 4 out of 5. Sometimes verges too much on the absurdism, but is a very interesting book in regarding conformity and groupthink, and I would recommend it on that basis. Propaganda Blitz by David Edwards and David Cromwell. 4 out of 5. Good book, very insightful into the untruths that the media is told, and how the media is never held to account for the misinformation that they spread, and eventually does come out to be untrue. Also discusses how the media and the government can sometimes be working together, specifically focusing on the UK. I think it's very interesting in that regard, an important book to be written, but sometimes they can fall foul to some of the criticisms that they're making when they make the mistakes that they are criticising themselves. So a slight verge on hypocrisy, but still I think it's a good book, and I would recommend it to anyone based in the UK or interested in UK politics. The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. 4 out of 5. I mean, most of Shakespeare's work, they're very good. I think this is much stronger in the second half, where it is very witty and very cleverly written. Not my favourite Shakespeare play, but still I think it is one that, if you're interested in reading Shakespeare, reading plays, it's definitely one that I would recommend. The King Dies by Ionesco. I think I'd give it 3.5 out of 10. Not my favourite Ionesco, much preferred Rhinoceroses. Slightly too absurd for me. In fairness, it could be just that my French isn't good enough to properly understand it, because it's very difficult to understand absurdism in a foreign language. But yeah, just personally, preferred Rhinoceros, not my favourite Ionesco, and not one that I would recommend to others. Don't Even Think About It by Georgia Marshall. 1 out of 5. It does nothing to aid the climate change debate. It is lacking in structure, lacking in providing anything concrete, and at times verges on the ideological, which makes it very hard to draw out accurate points and accurate claims by the author. There's No Planet B by Mike Berners-Lee. Falls victim to some of the same flaws as Don't Even Think About It, but does offer more concrete structure, and for that reason I'd give it a 2.5 out of 5. But again, not the book that I would recommend. The Bald Singer and the Lesson by Ionesco. 4 out of 5. As a whole, I think I prefer The Rhinoceros, but The Lesson was a very enjoyable short play, and this and The Rhinoceros I would recommend. I think The Bald Singer isn't as good. Probably my least favourite, even behind The King Dies, but The Lesson does make up for it, and primarily I'd recommend The Rhinoceros, but this one would be in second place. The Secret Lives of Colour by Cassia St. Clair. 4 out of 5. Very interesting, broken up into sort of 1-2 page short stories essentially about the origins of colour. And if you are interested in art history, or even history in general, I think it is a good book and a refreshing take on the subject. Inconvenient Facts by Gregory Wrightstone. 5 out of 5. Imagine a Twitter argument as a book. This is what you'd end up with. Good banter. Would not recommend. Cancer Ward by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. 5 out of 5. Great book, great author. Valuable insight into Soviet Russia. Great meditation on death, on what it's like to live as someone who's downtrodden, someone who is subject to pity, and the lives that they lead, and how to find purpose and meaning within that life. Would definitely recommend this book. Smart Solutions to Climate Change, edited by Bjorn Lomborg. 4 out of 5. It is a textbook, an academic textbook, so written in that format. It's very heavy. Good points are that it covers a lot of solution oriented, which I think is important when you're discussing a problem. To offer solutions, invited challenge to those solutions within the book, so gave multiple sides to the argument, but I wouldn't recommend it purely because it's in textbook form, and unless you're very interested in the subject, it's just not worth reading. The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success by Mark Jacquard. 3 out of 5. Fine as a book. More solutions oriented than the other two from earlier. Falls short in not engaging so well with the other side of the argument, although it does to an extent, and although it does offer a more solutions-based approach, there's nothing that is as concrete as it could be. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. 5 out of 5. A fantastically strange book. Brings to question the ideas of truth, the ideas of good and evil, and is certainly memorable. If you're interested in Russian literature, I would definitely recommend it. If you're interested in the absurd, fantastical, I would also recommend it. It's a very good book. Why We Disagree About Climate Change by Mike Hulme. 4 out of 5. Good book. One of the best on the subject in terms of not the climate science, but the tackling of it and the dissemination of science into the public sphere. Very well written. Even though it's a textbook, I think it's very accessible. If you are interested in the topic, if you are interested in science in the public sphere to laymen, then I would recommend this book. In June, I read 3 books, starting with The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I gave it a 4 out of 5, which is a good book. Not great, because it's a very archetypal story, and 5 out of 5, I like a bit more creativity, which is why I gave this, although, to some people their favourite book and a great book, only 4 out of 5. It's a story of adventure, finding yourself, finding the greatest treasure in your life, and I think it's a lesson that is valuable to everyone, and I would recommend it, but still, only 4 out of 5. A History of Modern Britain by Andrew Marr. So this is sort of looking at Thatcher around the 70s up to Brexit in the late 2010s. I'll give it a 4 out of 5. I think it is long and verbose in some parts, but nevertheless, it is covering quite a large time frame. It does touch upon it well, covers the important points, and I think does it in an objective manner, which is good to see. I would recommend this book if you have a particular interest in this era, but I think if you're just interested in UK history as a whole, there are better books that give a shorter overview than that. The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. I gave it 5 out of 5. Considering the 4 out of 5 given to The Hobbit, I might be slightly biased in that I'm a big fan of the Narnia series, and it was a pleasure to revisit this. Very nostalgic, and a story that I had forgotten, seeing as it isn't really remembered as the start of the series. Most people think the Chronicles of Narnia are, if they know that it's a series at all, but it's a great book, very entertaining, and yeah, if you haven't read this or the Narnia series, I would definitely recommend it. The British Empire and Commonwealth by Huxley. 3 out of 5. I mean, it is what it says it is. It just drags on in some parts. There are some interesting areas, and it touched on some interesting characters from the time. It's also interesting the account it gives as it was written 60, 70 years ago. So it's interesting to see how public perception of the British Empire and Commonwealth have changed. So from that point, it's very interesting, but the actual detail it gives on the Empire and the Commonwealth, do drag on, and it's not a book that I would recommend. Animal Farm by George Orwell, 5 out of 5. Great book, great allegory for Soviet Russia and authoritarianism in general, and how it enters into society. Very valuable book, always a very timely book, and I think that a book that everyone should read at least once in their life. The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, his best work. One of my favourite books, if not my favourite. 5 out of 5 for sure, and would definitely recommend it. It's a story about life, how to overcome the obstacles, how to not give up, just how to keep going when it seems bleak, when everything's against you. And even though that you might lose everything, don't give up. A Short History of England by Simon Jenkins, 4 out of 5. If you want an overview of English history, this is the one. This is the best book that I've found, at least. Not 5 out of 5 because it's slightly subjective in some aspects. And I think it's a history book. It shouldn't be, particularly when it's just giving an overview. It shouldn't stray into that territory. But nevertheless, gives a good overview, lets you see what's going on, and then from there you can pick out the areas that are of most interest and jump in there. Would recommend this book if you're interested in the history of England. The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa, 5 out of 5. Great book, great piece of Japanese literature. If you haven't read any, this is a great place to start. It's a really heartwarming and beautiful story about the relationships between us and the meaning that they can attain and the importance that we have to each other. I would recommend this. Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, 5 out of 5. Another great book, even though it is very short. Perhaps not my favourite Steinbeck. I think that would be East of Eden. But nevertheless, it is an insight into the harshness of society, where there is mistrust, constant suspicion, and everyone has their walls put up. And it's a story of how to break them down, how we can better relate to people, but also the tragedies that life can hold. And just when you think you've got it, just when you think things are going well, it all falls apart again. And it's a book that I would really recommend. Elements of Style by Strong and White, 4 out of 5. Good book. Interesting in terms of the stylistic recommendations that it makes. And I think ones that are important for whatever form of writing that you are doing. Maybe a little too restricted in terms of what it suggests. And there is something to say about finding your own unique style and not following the rules. And that is what creates the most engaging writing. So perhaps a good place to start, but always with the mind on developing a unique style. But I would recommend it to anyone who is interested in writing. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, 5 out of 5. Great book. Everyone should read it. How to overcome any obstacle, any odds, no matter what it is. How to be positive in any situation and really to take control of your own life is a book that everyone should read at least once in their life. The Poet's Manual by Francis Stillman, 4 out of 5. Very niche book, so I'm going to say straight away I would not recommend it, but it is interesting to see the different forms of poetry, particularly the non-Western ones, and to get an idea for what poetry can be, how it's evolved over time and become much less restrictive. Poetry today, there really is no style. There really is no set structure that needs to be followed, and it is interesting to see that evolution. Also some great excerpts from poetry in here that were interesting to read and good to become aware of. But yeah, not a book that I'd recommend. A Very Short Introduction to Economics by Partha Dasgupta, 3 out of 5. Serviceable for what it is, but considering it's a very short introduction to economics, I would expect it to be slightly broader in its scope, slightly too focused on macroeconomics, and I also think that it wasn't as accessible as I would expect from an introductory book. Not one that I'd recommend. A Little History of Economics by Noah Kishtani, 4 out of 5. Much better introduction, I think, than the very short introduction series. I would recommend this book if you were interested in economics. It gives a good historical overview and also shows the evolution of the subject with the different thinkers and the different ideas and how they related to the context of their times. Good book, good introduction. The World Trade Organization by Amrita Nalekar. A convoluted book, but that is more due to the nature of the organization than the author. I would give it a 4 out of 5 because it is a very challenging topic, broken down very well into the different aspects, looking at the evolution of the WTO. Not a book that I recommend though, as it is such a niche topic, but a good one if you're interested. Letters from a Stoic by Seneca. Great, very good book, 5 out of 5, would recommend. Surprisingly practical. It's literally written as letters from Seneca to one of his students, followers, friends. And so in that nature it's dealing with real world problems which, you know, have persisted for 2 millennia and probably even longer than that. So if you're interested in ancient philosophy of ancient Rome, very interesting, or just philosophy in general, how to live a better life, how to not let the problems in life burden you, and how to be freer in that regard, then it's definitely a book that I would recommend. Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, 5 out of 5, very well researched, very well written, heartfelt, and interesting to draw the distinctions between the society of Soviet Russia and modern Western society. It really highlights the differences and how far there is to fall as a society. What may be regarded as the most authoritarian and most restrictive society and most brutal society in Soviet Russia, and arguably the most prosperous that the world has seen in the West. The distinctions, the side-by-side comparisons are worth having, and I think that is a book that I would recommend if you do not have some other perspective on that idea. The Use of History by A.L. Rose. It is a good book, 4 out of 5, more on the idea of historiography, but also just in general, how to understand the world around you and how to be a better citizen, I guess, of the society you're in by understanding its history, understanding the meaning of the buildings, the events, and the goings on around you. Good book, not the easiest to find. I don't think it's really necessary for people to read, but some interesting ideas within it, but not recommend. Our Man in Havana by Graham Greene. Interesting story, sort of a spy novel set in Cuba. 4 out of 5. It's a good story, but not groundbreaking and not one that I would recommend. In August, I read 12 books, starting with On the Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. My favourite Nietzsche book, I'd give it a 5 out of 5. It's somewhat annexed to Beyond Good and Evil, which is another great book. On the Genealogy of Morals, as you might expect, focuses on the idea of morality, good and evil, challenging both those concepts, and also how to be an individual, how to be an asset to society rather than part of the crowd, and how to ensure that you're doing the best for yourself and by extension for those around you. Would recommend this book. The Spirit of English History by A.L. Rowse, 3 out of 5. It's okay. It gives an overview of English history, perhaps from a more philosophical standpoint, but as I said, there are better summaries. It's a difficult book to find, and it's not one that I would recommend. Biggles of the Camel Squadron by W.E. Johns, 3 stars. Collection of short stories set in World War One. Not the most complex stories, but it is a children's book. In that regard, they're fine. They're entertaining, follow a very similar pattern. There's not much variety in terms of the path of the story, and for that reason, yeah, couldn't give much more than 3 out of 5, and it's not a book that I recommend. Human All Too Human, again by Nietzsche, follows similar topics in terms of individuality, challenging morality, and challenging ideas and people who try and manipulate society as a whole, which is why he warns against being part of the crowd. Give it a 4 out of 5. It's got similar ideas, well, on genealogy of morals and most of Nietzsche's work. But it's not my favourite, as it's not as concise, and it can be quite random in terms of the maxims that it has within it, which are largely miscellaneous, and then it has some more targeted sections, which I do think has a lot of value in it, but not across the whole book, unfortunately. Back to Biggles and Biggles in Blue by W.E. Johns. It's a single story, not a collection of short stories. Still, I'd give it a 3-star. The story is lacking in complexity, but it's a children's story, so, not terrible, not disastrous. But yeah, it's following the trend similar to Our Man in Havana, of a detective story based in Cuba following the Second World War. It is vaguely interesting in that regard, but doesn't focus too much on the history and more on the case in hand, but not one of the most interesting ones, and not a book that I'd recommend. The Joy of Science by Friedrich Nietzsche, 4 out of 5. Similar themes to the other Nietzsche books, but slightly more focused on taking action. It's an interesting book, as pretty much all of Nietzsche's books are, and quite actionable, but still only give it 4 out of 5. And I would recommend it as a Nietzsche book, but not ahead of On the Genealogy of Morals. I think that's a great starting point in regards to Nietzsche's work. History of England by G.M. Trevelyan. It is a good history of England, but I would only give it 4 out of 5, as I think it can be quite heavy reading. There are areas, for me particularly in the early history, that weren't as interesting. So it's very much some interesting parts, some which are less so interesting. I think a better course of tackling history books, is to read a short overview, like a short introduction of England, a short history of England, and then specifically targeting the areas that are most interest to you. The problem with these overviews is that there would invariably be parts of the history that you just aren't interested in. So I would not recommend this book for that reason. Great Britain and the Empire by James A. Williamson, probably 3.5 out of 5. It was an interesting account of the British Empire and the other European countries and their approach to colonialism as well. More focused on the monetary side of imperialism. And it's also interesting to have a more dated account of the imperial conquests of the European nations and see how that's relative to our modern day interpretations of it. Having said that, not a book that I would recommend, again, for the difficulty to acquire and the rather niche aspect of, well, imperialism. The Social Distance Between Us by Darren McGarvey, which I read as an ebook. I give it 3 stars. It was unfortunately lacking nuance, and the criticisms that were made by the author, in my interpretation, the author himself fell foul of. And I struggle to appreciate a book, especially a non-fiction book, which exhibits those traits. So 3 stars. Interesting, some good case studies, but not a book that I'd recommend. The Winter Engagement by Christelle Dabo. I would give a 4 out of 5. Good book, interesting world that has been created by the author, and a lot of political intrigue, which I enjoy in a book, coupled with, I wouldn't call it a love story, but a relationship playing out, and not just between the boy and the girl, but between their families and their distant relatives as well. Interesting read, good story, good world. It is a book that I would recommend. Carry On Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse, 5 out of 5. Great book, very funny, very well written. If you haven't heard of it, I would give it a go. And if you are aware of the characters of Jeeves and Wooster, then I would definitely recommend this collection of stories. They're very good. Final book in August was Conspiracy by Michael Shermer, again an ebook. Gave it 3 out of 5. It was fine. It had some interesting points, an interesting breakdown of different conspiracies, namely JFK and 9/11. Where it was lacking was in terms of the solutions it offered to talk to conspiracy theorists or even talk to people who have differing opinions to you. The solutions offered weren't great. They were barely solutions, to be honest. And I think that really detracted from the overall message of the book and really the purpose of the book. So it's not one that I'd recommend. In September, I had 12 books, the first being English Social History by G.M. Trevelyan, which is an overview of English history from the periods, well, the time of Chaucer to Queen Victoria. So from about the 14th century to 19th century Britain. It is better than previous overviews, purely because it's focusing on a social history, which I find more interesting, as it focuses on the day-to-day lives and activities of people living within England, which I think is more engaging than when the political and economic history is also brought in. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book, although Trevelyan is an excellent historian and one of the best writers within history. I would recommend social histories as a whole if you are interested in reading about the history of any country. I find they're much easier to relate to and because of that more engaging. The Economic Organisation of England by William Ashley, 3 out of 5. In contrast to social histories, which are more engaging, economic histories are dry. And economics is an area that I'm particularly fond of. So this wasn't the most interesting read for me. Perhaps if you were interested in economics, it would be. But yeah, I'm afraid I cannot recommend an economic history of England or an economic history of anything, to be honest. Just not for me. The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, 5 out of 5. It's a beautiful book, wonderful story about friendship and about being there for your friends no matter what they do, but also on a deeper philosophical level. It tackles the tension between progress and tradition and how that can manifest in day-to-day lives and the relationships that we have with our peers and those around us. So for that reason, I think it is definitely worth reading or rereading. If you haven't read it in a long time, it is a beautiful story, but also has a very surprisingly deep message underlying it from what I had remembered. Well, based really only on the film. This is actually my first reading of Wind in the Willows, surprisingly. The next two books are Henry V and the Invasion of France by Jacobs and Henry V the Play by William Shakespeare. So I first read the book on Henry V and the Invasion of France, which is a primer, to get a bit of historical background before reading the play, both for the first time. I haven't actually encountered anything to do with Henry V, apart from that film with The King, with Timothée Chalamet, and Lily Rose Depp, I think. But I've always been interested in that period, the 100 Years' War, Agincourt, and I suppose really English-French relations. So it was about time that I got around to it. The primer, the history of Henry V, I thought was good. Give it 4 out of 5. It was certainly serviceable, gave a quick overview. I'm sure there are better ones that are more accessible, as this book is quite dated, an old book. But yeah, I definitely recommend reading a primer before tackling some of the more historical plays from Shakespeare. The play Henry V was good. I think I'd also give it a 4 out of 5. Not my favourite play, but it had some very funny moments, particularly the scenes which were in French. They were very good and surprising. I did not expect that in this play, but yeah. I would recommend the play, but it wouldn't be the first Shakespeare play that I would suggest to people. The next two books on the list also come as a pair, and they are Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass in a single volume by Lewis Carroll. I'll give them both 5 out of 5. Probably preferred Alice in Wonderland more, but I think they're both fantastically weird stories with matching characters, which are very memorable and really add to the charm of these stories. I think they're a feast for the imagination, for children especially. I think they are perfect books to read at that period in life, but perhaps more so for adults to remember the absurd and fantastical elements of life and that nothing really is straightforward. Nothing is normal. Everything's strange, everything's weird, and it can be found every turn if we only know where to look. So it is certainly a book that I would recommend to anyone. Next is my favourite Shakespeare play, and that is Julius Caesar. 5 out of 5, obviously. Recommended, obviously. I think that is one of the most interesting plays, considering Brutus is the hero of this play. He is the protagonist, and yet he is the one who kills the titular character, which is a strange setup, is a strange arrangement for a play, but raises a lot of questions about the motives and the reasons for Brutus carrying out the act that he did. His sense of duty and his sense of service, not to his friends, but to the state, and what he was willing to do in service of that. It's a remarkable play, and has some very memorable lines in it by Julius Caesar in the early acts, but also in particular the funeral speech by Mark Antony, which I think is one of the most legendary pieces of Shakespearean writing. As I said, definitely a book that I would recommend. Next is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. What can I say? 5 out of 5, great book, great start to a series, and just as good in French. Definitely would recommend. Next is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer. 5 out of 5. It is probably the definitive history of the Nazis and their rise to power, their rule and their fall, written from someone who was a correspondent at that time living in Nazi Germany. I don't think that you can get a better account of what it was actually like to be in that country. Not just that, but how easy it was to go along with the rise of the Nazi Party and to find them very innocuous, find them almost on your side, and the willingness of the population to turn a blind eye. It really emphasises how societies fall and how complicit people can be in that, in the sense that they don't realise what's going on. They can't see what is going on right in front of our eyes. It's always a timeless book. It is incredibly well written, well researched, and you think you know some of the things that the Nazis did and the horrors of them, but the more you read, the more you find out, the more disturbing. To see what can happen to what can happen to an established democracy, how quickly it can fall, and how quickly things can change. It's certainly a scary thought, indeed. Next is The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. 5 out of 5. Possibly my favourite Dostoevsky novel, but it's hard to make that call because he certainly had some bangers, that's for sure. It's a story about innocence, about the corruption of said innocence, about love, honesty, and what it means to be a person, what it means to be human in a society where every relationship is transactional, every action is expecting something in return, and yet you plant someone like the prince in that society. What can they do? What will happen to that innocence, to that beauty? Will it save the world, or will it be corrupted? It's beautifully written, as all Dostoevsky novels are, and has a lot that we can take away from it. It's certainly one that I recommend. Finally, we have Antony and Cleopatra by William Shakespeare. Again, 5 out of 5. I think I might be biased towards this time period because Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra are some of my favourite Shakespeare plays. It's ultimately a love story, and the things that we do for love, the sacrifices that we make, and the choices that we have to take in regards to the duties that we have elsewhere, but also the duty to the person that we love, and the tragic consequences that can arise from that. It's very entertaining, very well written. The characters of both Mark Antony and Cleopatra are very engaging and very enjoyable. If you're interested in Shakespeare, if you're interested in plays, this is one that I would recommend. In October, I read 2 books. The first was Digital Madness by Nicholas Kardaras. It was also an ebook. I'll give it 3 out of 5. It was straightforward in the message that it was trying to convey about the dangers of living too much in the digital and having too much emphasis placed on social media. I don't think it necessarily added anything novel to the scenario. It also lacked in the concreteness of its solutions and philosophized a bit too much for my liking. So it's not a book that I would recommend. The other book that I read in October was the New Oxford Book of War Poetry. It is a great collection. I'll give it 5 out of 5. I think war poetry in general is very engaging because of how difficult it is to put yourself in the situation of someone going to war if you haven't actually experienced it. And it is certainly a harrowing read to have those accounts, to read and glimpse the rawness of human emotion in such a difficult climate and in such a high octane, high stakes environment. It really brings out the rawness that is essential for good poetry. And perhaps I wouldn't necessarily recommend this volume, but more generally any volume of war poetry, and just reading war poetry in general. I think it is well worth doing and really opens your eyes to the depths of the human experience and the luxuries that we have in the modern world and in peacetime. In November, I read 10 books, the first being Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I gave it 4 out of 5. I think it is a classic. I think it is a great book, but the first of 3 parts was just not that engaging for me. I didn't really care for it, and I would skip it if I were rereading. I think the second and the third volume, where we start to hear more about Victor Frankenstein and his creation's experiences, are where the story really takes off and is very interesting. Those 2 alone, without the first part, I'd probably give 5 out of 5, but with it, going to be a 4 out of 5. It focuses on resentment, the ambition and the search for knowledge, and our responsibility for our actions and how we can impact the world around us. It is a great book, lots of lessons to take away from it, and a very compelling story. I think also Frankenstein is one of the most misunderstood stories, especially because people mostly think that Frankenstein is the creation as opposed to the scientist. It is certainly a book that I would recommend, and I think culturally is a very important book. Next up are 2 books by Friedrich Nietzsche in 1 volume, and they are The Twilight of the Idols and The Antichrist. Again, both 4 out of 5. I think, as with all Nietzsche, very interesting ideas, very engaging, mainly focusing on finding purpose in life, addressing the idea of suffering and how that can lend itself to purpose, and the use of morality to control and to exert power in society and over crowds. It is not the Nietzsche book that I recommend, as said earlier, on the genealogy of morals, I think is the best starting point. But if you do delve into Nietzsche's work, you want to read more, I think these 2 books are a good way to develop an understanding of Nietzsche's thought. Next is The Myth of Mental Illness by Thomas Saz. I would give it a 5 out of 5. I think it is a very interesting and nuanced approach to the idea of mental health and how that is often used to alienate and to other people by assigning them labels and trying to create this idea of normal and what it is to be normal in terms of mental health and in terms of the way that you're acting. Anything that deviates from our conditioned idea of what is normal, we point out and we label and we other. And this book attempts to challenge that and attempts to challenge our interpretation of another's actions and the prejudices that we can assign to them and force upon them. I think it's a very important book, very timely book, always timely, and it is one that I would certainly recommend to everyone. Next is A Modern Man in Search of Soul by Carl Jung. I would give it a 4 out of 5. I think there are some incredibly interesting ideas within this book, particularly on improving understanding of the world around you creativity, finding meaning in your own life and how to grow as a person, and also the idea of the shadow and your shadow self and integrating that side of you into your lighter side to become whole. I hesitate to give it a 5 out of 5 because there are just some sections which are more for the psychologist in training. For example, the sections on dream analysis, which I didn't find the most interesting. To be fair, it's not a topic that I've looked into heavily. That is dreams and interpreting dreams. I haven't read Freud's volume of it, for example. So perhaps it would be more interesting in future reads, but at this stage of my knowledge development, I would only give it a 4 out of 5 for myself. But having said that, I would recommend reading this book and Young in general. Next, we have The Charterhouse of Parma by Stendhal. I would give it a 4 out of 5. It is a good story, very interesting in how the characters are developed, the setting, the political intrigue that goes on, and how power is used to move the different pieces around to achieve the ends that you desire. At its heart, it really is a love story, but with all these different characters and goings on around it, it makes it a much more complex and richer story. I give it a 4.5 and not a 5, as I'm constantly comparing it to Tolstoy, as they were writing more or less as contemporaries, and their stories tend to have a similar setting, that being the upper classes of society. And as I'm comparing it to Tolstoy, unfortunately it's just not Tolstoy, and it can't live up to that, and for me it just can't be a 5 out of 5 in that regard. But I would recommend Stendhal. I think he is a compelling author. He's just a bit more fantastical than Tolstoy. The characters in Tolstoy, the setting in Tolstoy could be real. They could be people that you know and that did exist, whereas the stories by Stendhal are more fantastical in nature, and for me take on the character of more legend and mythology as opposed to concrete reality. Next is The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. I'll give it a 4 out of 5. I think it's a good detective story. It's interesting, well written, not really much more to say in that. I don't think it's got necessarily philosophical elements to it. It's just a good gumshoe detective novel. Has the right character beats, has the right plot development, well paced, good twist at the end, very enjoyable. Would recommend. The final Nietzsche book of the year is The Will to Power, and I would give it 5 out of 5. It is perhaps Nietzsche's most influential work. I say that as from this book, there are the clearest linkages to the philosophies of the Nazi Party, predominantly the idea of the Superman, and that there are a subset of people who can dictate the lives of others, and not only can but should, as they are the ones who have the skills and the power to do so. Nietzsche himself wasn't a fan of anti-Semitism or German nationalism even. He says at one point that he wishes that he didn't have to write his books in German, as he felt that it gave the Germans too much pride, and he had great disdain for German culture, or the lack of it, that he claimed. Having said that, the author is not in control of where the ideas go, and unfortunately for Nietzsche, they were taken by the Nazi Party and they ran with them. So in that regard, it's very interesting to see those linkages. If you have had a taste of Nietzsche's writings and do enjoy them, I would recommend reading The Will to Power. Also, if you're interested in history in regards to World War II and authoritarianism in general, the ideas are quite clearly and provocatively laid out in Nietzsche's work. Next is another Stendhal book. It is The Red and the Black this time. I would also give it 4.5 out of 5. maybe a little bit more than Charles House of Parma, maybe a 4.6, 4.7. It is a better book in my opinion. I prefer the story. It focuses more on ambition and pride within an individual and how that impacts those around them, and how two proud characters interact and bounce off each other. It is lacking in the same way that the Charles House of Parma was in terms of comparisons to Tolstoy, and that it is a more fantastical book. Maybe some people would prefer that to the not cold reality of Tolstoy, but the more realistic portrayal. I just find Tolstoy more engaging and better written stories, but having said that, Stendhal is still a great author. The Red and the Black is still a great book and is one of the classics. It's just not Tolstoy. The final book for November is Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. 5 out of 5. It's a great book. The ultimate message of the book is, for me, learning how to laugh and how to be happy again, how to be an individual, and how to survive in a system that just wants to drag you down. It is a beautiful story, heartbreaking at times, but beautiful nevertheless. Reading it really reminded me of Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, and the other Ken Kesey novel that I'll get to later on also reminded me of East of Eden. I think the parallels between them are in this regard, in regard to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Of Mice and Men, is a society that is trying to drag you down, that is confrontational, suspicious, and doesn't want you to be happy. And it is how to find that humanity while living in these societies. And if that is even possible, unfortunately in both of these stories, no. But there is still some hope that it can be possible in reality, in the real world. I would definitely recommend this Ken Kesey book, but this one alone. In December, I read 5 books, and we start with Ken Kesey's Sometimes a Great Notion. 3 out of 5, maybe a 2 out of 5. I did not enjoy reading this book. Every time it came to reading it, I didn't want to. To be honest, I should have just put it down and read something else, but I pushed through and it was not fun. I would liken it to East of Eden because it follows the same Cain and Abel story in terms of a rift and resentment between two brothers. It also has a very meandering narrative which can at times be hard to follow. I didn't find that the case in East of Eden, but in Sometimes a Great Notion I certainly did, and I don't think it was as well written as Steinbeck's novel. I don't doubt Ken Kesey's ability as an author, because One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest as his debut novel was incredible. His follow-up, Sometimes a Great Notion, maybe he was trying too much. Maybe he got a bit too big for his boots, but it did not live up to the incredible debut and just felt like he was trying too much, and I can't recommend this book. The next book for December is At Work in the Ruins by Dougal Hine. It was another digital copy, and I would give it a 4 out of 5. It's about the climate debate, but specifically how to unify discussions and the efforts on tackling climate change. It was a refreshing read in comparison to the other books surrounding climate change that I've read. I give it a 4 out of 5 as it was more philosophical in nature and less concrete in what can be done going forward. However, I still think it is a valuable read as the questions that it raised and the thought-provoking points that it raised are definitely useful, are original, at least to me, and I found very interesting. So I would certainly recommend this book when it does come out. The next book is No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. I would give it a 5 out of 5. It is a Japanese author and is very reminiscent of Mishima, who coincidentally also committed suicide at a very young age, as Osamu Dazai did as well. The themes and the touching points are very similar between the two authors. I don't know much about the background of Osamu Dazai and when he was writing, I believe he was a contemporary of Mishima. And so perhaps growing up in imperialist Japan gave them those ideas of fear and resentment, of not living up to anything, not being good enough, and having dissatisfaction with the way that their lives were going and who they were. It is a powerful book, one that I would recommend. I certainly preferred the nuances of Osamu Tezui's writing in comparison to Mishima. And I think this is a good philosophical introduction to Japanese literature. The penultimate book of 2022 was The Long Goodbye by Raymond Chandler, the second of his book that I read, and another in the Philip Marlowe series, which follows the life of a private detective. I would give this a 5 out of 5. I preferred this to The Big Sleep. I'm not sure why, but it was just the feeling that I had when I finished. Perhaps the story was slightly more real to me, so it could have happened. The turns of the story were more engaging. Actually, now that I said that it was more real, I just remember some of the plot points, and perhaps that was not the reason that what it was more engaging, but maybe it was the plot points, the pacing, and the twists that occurred. I think in this book you had a better idea of what could have been coming, whereas in The Big Sleep it was quite abrupt. But The Long Goodbye, there were more breadcrumbs that were dropped to allow the reader to follow them, to work out what was going on, and it made the payoff more satisfactory. Whereas The Big Sleep, it was an interesting payoff, but perhaps not one that you could have seen coming as a reader. So I would recommend both of them, to be honest, but The Long Goodbye over The Big Sleep. And I think The Long Goodbye is a 6th in the Philip Marlowe series. The Big Sleep is a 1st, but they're standalone. You don't need to read them in order at all, or even to read all of them. And the final and 108th book of 2022 was William Golding's The Lord of the Flies. This is a book that I read in school over 10 years ago, and I didn't realise how good a book it was. But reading again, it is hauntingly good. It's engagement with the idea of violence and how a society can devolve into violence, into just being brutes, is a stark reminder of what has happened in the past and what can happen again. We are not so secure in the societies that we live in. They are fragile. They need respect and looking after. And stories like The Lord of the Flies really hammers that point home. Some of the plot points in Lord of the Flies were devastating and really, made you pause, made you think about what had just happened and how did it happen. Because William Golding writes in a beautiful way where it's sometimes left up to the imagination, and he doesn't explicitly state what happened. So you have to sort of reread, did that happen? Is that what is being suggested here? And unfortunately, yes, that is what happened. That is what's being suggested. It's a beautiful book, very well written. And I would recommend this to anyone and everyone. I think it is essential reading and an excellent book. So that was my 2022 in books. Quite a few there and a lot of good books. Very few that I really didn't enjoy, at least in regards to fiction. If I had to pick a favourite, it would be The Fratricides. First time I read it this year, and excluding the books that I'd read before, because some of those I do prefer, such as The Idiot and Old Man of the Sea. But new books, The Fratricides was great. One that I'm eager to go back to. It was about a period that I didn't know much about. The characters were phenomenal. The ending was devastating. And if you read one book from the list, that is the one that I would recommend. Hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what your favourite books of 2022 were. If you've read any of the ones that I also went through, and certainly let me know if you disagree with any of my thoughts about them. Otherwise, yeah, see you in the next one.